I wasn't in a good place that fall, and by the time the first hard cold came down off the ridge, I'd stopped pretending otherwise. Folks in town still called me Dale from Reynolds Timber, even though Reynolds Timber had been sold off in parcels years earlier, and I had been retired long enough to forget where I put my good scale stick. I was 68, living alone on my father's mountain homestead outside Forks, in the same house where I learned to sharpen a chain before I learned algebra, and I had reached a season where I trusted sore teeth, weather reports, and the heft of wet rounds in my hands. But I did not trust next week. Next week was where bad news waited. Next week was where ice took hold. Marlene had died 3 winters before after one black ice slide on the county road heading into town. She came through the wreck itself, bruised and sore and still making jokes at the clinic, but pneumonia settled in her chest by the end of that month and never let go. People mean well when they say she went peaceful. What they mean is she didn't yell. She was still frightened, and I was still standing there with a paper cup of stale coffee when she took one short breath, and then none at all. Grief didn't hit me like a single blow. It moved in and arranged furniture. It sat at my table, slept in my bed, followed me to the shed, and checked my watch for me when I forgot what day it was. My son Caleb lived down toward Olympia with his wife and 2 little ones, and he called me once a month with the same careful tone a man uses when he walks a beam in wet boots. "How you holding up, Dad?" he'd ask, and I'd say, "Still upright," because that sounded practical and didn't ask him for more than he had to give. He was 41, good with numbers, good with his hands when he had to be, and still carrying old splinters from the years I spent more time chasing contracts than watching his baseball games. We never yelled at each other, not anymore. We were polite. Polite can be a kind of distance that doesn't rattle dishes but keeps the room cold. One Tuesday in late October, his call came while I was gutting the ashpan and trying to coax damp newspaper into a flame. I let it ring twice because my knuckles were black with soot. Then I swiped at the screen with the side of my thumb. "Morning, Dad. It's near noon." "Right, sorry. We had parent-teacher stuff this morning. You doing okay up there?" "Got the stove running again. That counts." He chuckled, a tired little sound. Maya asked if Grandpa still has that giant saw. "I got 6 giant saws." "Which one?" "The loud one." "They're all loud." He laughed for real then, and for a second, it felt like old days in the truck, both of us smelling like fir pitch and 2-stroke. Then he cleared his throat. "You need anything from town? I could send up a delivery." "I got beans, coffee, diesel, and dry socks. I'm rich." "You know what I mean." "I do. I'm all right, Cal." "Okay. We'll come up sometime after the holidays." "Road gets tricky by then." "Yeah, we'll see how it goes." We said goodbye like 2 men setting down a crate together, careful not to crush fingers. After he hung up, I stood in the kitchen with the phone still in my hand and looked at Marlene's mug on the top shelf, the chipped blue one with the loon on it. And I set the phone face down like it might start talking again, if I didn't. Most days ran on muscle memory. Coffee at 4:30, black and too hot. Feed Ranger, my old blue-tick hound, who had gone grey in the muzzle around the same time I did. Check the sky from the back porch and decide how far up the slope I could work. Before noon, fog turned the duff slick. Cut salvage off my own backlot, mostly windfall and dead standing alder, then buck, split, stack, sweep, repeat. Supper was often eaten standing at the sink, canned stew, crackers, maybe eggs if the hens felt generous. I kept a legal pad by the stove with columns for fuel, meds and weather notes, because writing things down kept me from misremembering what I had done and what I only meant to do. By the 2nd week of November, I had the winter pattern locked in tight enough that I could run it half asleep. That was useful, because sleep had become thin and jumpy. I'd wake at 1:30, certain I heard Marlene moving through the hall in her socks, then lie there listening to the refrigerator hum and Ranger's slow breathing from the rug by the door. Some nights I got up and sat at the table with one lamp on low and read old logging journals my dad kept in the 70s, pages full of rain totals, line breaks, and pencil sketches of road grades. He wrote exactly what happened and nothing else. I tried to do the same with my own mind. Facts first, feelings later. Sometimes later never came. Sunday evenings were the hardest because they carried that old family shape. Roast in the oven, football low on the radio, somebody laughing in the other room. Now it was just me, scraping mud off boots by the back steps, checking tarp ties in the dark, and counting firewood like it was a prayer I did not quite believe in. I kept one cord stacked by the shed as a buffer. If snow came hard overnight, that cord meant I could stay off the road and keep the pipes from freezing while I waited out a plough. I measured it square, chest high, ends tight. Order mattered. Order was what a man had when answers ran out. Ranger followed me through all of it, stiff in the hips, but still proud enough to trot 2 steps ahead whenever we walked the fence line. He had his own routines: 3 circles before lying down, 1 bark at the mail truck, suspicious stare at ravens, deep trust in anyone who smelled like cedar and bacon grease. On the colder mornings, he leaned his shoulder against my shin while I split kindling, and I'd rest a hand on his neck without looking down. That pressure kept me in the present. Wood in one hand, maul in the other, dog at my leg, breath in my chest. Simple accounting. Town was 15 miles of curves and 1 bad bridge, so I kept visits short. Hardware, feed, pharmacy, back home before dark. People asked kind questions and watched my face while I answered like they were checking for cracks in window glass. Mrs. Ortiz at the pharmacy always slid my blood pressure refill across the counter with a peppermint and said, "You take care of yourself, Dale." I always said, "Trying to," and meant it both ways. Trying to stay alive. Trying to look like I had a plan. Plans had been easier when Marlene was there to point out what I forgot. "You can drop a cedar exactly where you want it," she used to tell me. "But you can't find your glasses if they're on your own head." She wasn't wrong. I found them in the freezer once. The first frost that stayed came early that year, whitening the pasture and edging every fence wire in silver. I spent that day cutting rounds from an old blowdown by the creek, working slower than I used to, because my hands had started talking back. Arthritis settled in my knuckles like a tenant with a long lease. By dusk, I had enough split and stacked to feel useful, and usefulness was close to comfort. I shut the shed, latched the gate, and stood for a minute in the yard while light drained out of the trees. The mountain went quiet in the way it does before real weather. No bird fuss, no branch chatter, only distant water and ranger's tags ticking as he shook himself. Inside, I ate reheated beans and cornbread at the sink, then carried my plate to the table and sat anyway, because the house felt less empty when I made myself use a chair. Marlene's ring still hung on a small nail by the stove where I had put it after the funeral. She'd slipped it off in the hospital when her fingers swelled, and I couldn't bear to put it in a drawer with batteries and loose screws. I looked at it most nights and told myself I was keeping it safe for no reason I could explain. Not moving on, not moving back, just keeping. That Sunday, I checked the wood one last time with a flashlight before bed. 1 cord stood there neat and dry under the overhang. I tapped the stack with my glove, listened to the hollow knock of seasoned cedar, and felt a plain, practical satisfaction. Enough for 4 days, maybe 5 if I banked the stove right. I scratched Ranger behind the ears, locked the mudroom door, and climbed the stairs slow, knee-popping on the 3rd step like always. Sometime before dawn, wind came down the draw and rattled the eaves. I woke, listened, and did the arithmetic men living alone do in winter. Fuel, water, road, body. Could I keep heat if power went out? Could I get to town if I had to? Could I chop if the knee went bad? Could I make it through one more season in a house full of ghosts and still call it a life? I lay there staring at the ceiling, Ranger snoring softly below, and I remember thinking that survival had become a narrow kind of work, honest but joyless, like planing boards for a house no one would ever move into. Monday broke grey and brittle. I pulled on wool socks, dragged on my coat, and stepped out into air sharp enough to make my teeth ache. Ranger trotted ahead toward the shed, tail high, and then stopped so sudden his nails clicked on frozen dirt. I looked past him and felt my breath catch in my chest. Not from fear, just from the clean shock of seeing something where nothing had been when I checked it last. Beside my single cord, under the same overhang, stood another full cord of dry cedar, cribbed tighter than mine, squared better than mine, stacked at a pace no man my age could manage in one night. Ranger glanced at me, then back to the tree line, and wagged like he expected me to greet somebody. I took 3 steps closer, put my hand on the fresh split face of a top log, and found it cold, real, and solid under my palm. I left my hand there longer than I needed to, feeling the grain and the hard chill in that fresh, split face, like touch alone might sort it into something ordinary. The stack was exact, not quick and careless, not tossed up to get it done before daylight. Exact. Ends locked tight, bark turned out where it should be, top course pitched just enough that rain would run instead of soak. Whoever did it knew wood, knew weather, knew my shed overhang leaked at the left corner if snow blew sideways. Ranger circled once, nose down, then looked up past me toward the cedars, and wagged so hard his whole hind end swung with it. I set my glove on the top log and checked what I knew how to check. Species first. Mostly cedar. Some fir mixed in, all seasoned enough to wring dry when I knocked knuckles against it. Lengths cut right around 16 inches, a hair under on a few pieces, which meant they'd fit my stove without me cussing at midnight, with the door open and smoke in my face. I looked for saw marks I recognized, a chain chatter pattern. Anything that said this came from my own pile, and I'd gone half blind to my work. The cuts were clean, sharper than what my old shoulder had been giving me that month. It wasn't kids fooling around. It wasn't wind. It wasn't me forgetting. The yard was crusted with old frost and a skin of powder snow from the night before, enough to hold sign if sign was there. I stepped back and crouched by the base of the stack. Tracks ran around it in a loose arc, not crossing through my kindling crate, not trampling the rake, not knocking over the oil can I'd left by the post. Deep impressions, each one longer than my forearm and set wide apart. Toe marks clear in front, heel pressed heavy, but the pattern was careful. Deliberate. Like whoever made them had watched every foot placement and refused to break anything smaller than itself. I stood up too fast and felt the world tilt, then settle. Not fear. More like the moment a tree starts to go and the hinge cuts cleaner than expected, and you realize your plan is working and failing at the same time. Ranger came over and leaned his shoulder into my leg. I scratched behind his ear and heard my own voice come out rough. "Well," I said, looking at no one, "you got better friends than I do, old man." He huffed and sat down like that settled it. Inside, the kitchen looked the same as it had every morning since Marlene died. Steam off the kettle, dish towel hanging crooked, her blue loon mug on the top shelf where I never moved it. Except now my hands would not stop shaking long enough to pour coffee clean. I slopped half a cup into the saucer and stood there watching dark liquid spread like a map line. For a while I did nothing useful. I listened to the stove tick and the clock hum, and Ranger drinking from his metal bowl in the mudroom. The house felt too small for whatever had happened outside. I told myself this couldn't be real. I told myself there was a plain answer, and I was being dramatic because I hadn't slept through a full night in months. I can hear my own head in those moments, and it goes practical fast. Somebody from church took pity. One of Caleb's old friends came up. Maybe I stacked 2 chords and wrote one by mistake on the legal pad. I walked to the table, flipped the pad open, and checked my own handwriting. Sunday. 1 chord by shed, squared, tarp ties checked, ash emptied, diesel 3/4 tank. Same ink, same block letters. No gap big enough to hide a cord of wood. By that afternoon, low cloud had dropped into the trees, and the light went flat as old wool. I pulled on my coat, took Ranger and walked the back lot, because moving helps me think better than staring at walls. The cut trail bent around blown alder, and old stumps furred with moss, then climbed toward the ridge where my father used to set chokers before sunrise. Everything smelled like wet cedar and iron-cold air. Ranger stayed close, stopping now and then to sniff one place hard, then look up slope as if waiting for someone else to catch up. I kept looking too. I saw nothing bigger than drifting mist between trunks, but the feeling of being alone shifted from emptiness to company, and I did not know what to do with that. At the creek crossing, I sat on a slick log and rested my elbows on my knees until my back stopped aching. Water moved under a skim of ice, thin and quick, making that glassy tink sound it makes when winter is still practicing. I said Marlene's name out loud because I had run out of dignified ways to carry silence. "If you're in on this," I said, "you could have picked a less confusing method." The woods gave me nothing back except a raven winging over the draw and Ranger sneezing into the ferns. Still, I sat there a long time with my breath hanging in front of me and admitted the part I kept boarded up. I was tired of being competent. Tired of doing every task right and ending every day with the same hollow room inside me. Tired of measuring my life by whether pipes froze and bills got paid. A man can survive on discipline. He cannot live there forever. By Wednesday of that week, I had run out of private explanations and started testing public ones. I called Vernon Pike down Canyon because he was the nearest full-time neighbor and the kind of man who'd help stack wood without making a speech about it. "Vernon, you been up my way late Sunday?" "Nope," he said. I heard a compressor cycling in his shop. "You all right?" "Fine, just had somebody add to my pile." He gave a short laugh. "If somebody's handing out free labor, send 'em here next." "Tracks are odd." "Bear?" "Not in this cold, not like this." He got quiet for a second. "You want me to come take a look?" I looked out the window at Ranger asleep with his nose tucked under his tail, then at the extra cord under my shed roof, straight as carpentry. "No," I said. "I just needed to ask. You call if you need anything, Dale." "I know." That night, I ate stew standing at the sink again, then made myself sit at the table anyway. Wind dragged across the eaves and the house clicked and settled around me. I kept seeing those tracks looping the pile without touching a single loose stick, and the shape of that care gnawed at me more than the size of them. Plenty of things in the woods can break. Not many choose not to. A week later, snow came down thick and muffled for 2 days, the kind that erases edges and makes the whole mountain seem to breathe slower. Sunday evening, I checked my wood at dusk. 1 cord ready, tarp snug, hook latch set on the shed door. Ranger stood beside me, ears half up, not tense, just attentive. He stared into the trees west of the pasture and gave 1 quiet wag without leaving my side. I followed his gaze and saw only snow threading through cedar limbs in the last blue of light. Monday dawned white and soundless. No jay racket, no squirrel chatter. Even the creek seemed hushed under snowpack. My boots made the only noise in the yard, and that noise felt rude. Ranger moved ahead in a careful trot, then slowed as we came around the shed corner, tail up and sweeping in steady arcs like he was walking towards somebody he already trusted. There was another full cord beside mine, better than the first one. Squared clean, top covered with bark slabs weighted at the corners. Windside braced with two heavier rounds so tight I had to work fingers between them to test it. Whoever had stacked it had improved on my own system, and I hated how much I admired that before I had time to be offended. Then I looked down and forgot to breathe for a second. At the base of the fresh stack, on the packed snow where no falling branch could have arranged them, lay 4 smooth river stones set in a simple cross. Across the center rested a small spray of wintergreen, leaves still glossy, red berries bright against all that white. Not dropped, placed. I crouched, knees complaining, and hovered my hand over the stones without touching them. They were clean, no mud on the undersides where they met snow, which meant whoever set them had carried them in close and taken time. Wintergreen didn't grow near my shed. Nearest patch was down by the creek bend past the old skid road. A person could have done it. A person could have done all of it. But no boot prints crossed the open yard. Just those deep, long impressions making a half circle and fading at the tree line where snow had drifted in. Ranger stepped up beside me and sniffed the berries once, then sat. Not a hair raised, no warning rumble, just calm, like a dog at church who knows he's supposed to be polite. He turned his head toward the cedars and gave a soft whine, not worried, almost greeting. I looked where he looked and felt that same strange pressure in my chest, sorrow and wonder taking up the same space without fighting. "Much obliged," I said, and the words fogged in front of me and disappeared. Saying thank you to empty air would have embarrassed me 10 years earlier. That morning, it felt like the only honest thing available. I spent an hour documenting what I could because facts were still my handrail. I fetched the old tape measure from the mudroom and took dimensions of the prints before sun hit them. Length 18 1/4 on the clearest one, width just under 8 at the broadest point. Stride varied, as if the walker adjusted each step around tools and kindling. I marked 2 impressions with small stakes to check melt rate. I photographed the stack, the stone cross, the wintergreen, and the track line with my phone and with Marlene's old point and shoot, because batteries fail when it matters. Then I wrote all of it in the legal pad in block letters, so plain they looked like someone else's hand. By noon, light snow started again, soft and steady. I carried the stone cross and wintergreen exactly 6 feet to the right and set them on the flat top of my chopping block, not to hide them, just to keep them from being trampled if weather turned ugly. I left the arrangement intact. Ranger watched me do it, then walked to the edge of the yard and stood facing the trees, tail moving once every few seconds, patient as a man waiting for a late truck. I stood with him until my toes went numb and my eyes watered from cold. Nothing stepped out. Nothing needed to. The stillness itself felt occupied, not by threat, by attention. There's a difference, and I knew it in my bones before I could explain it in words. When I finally went inside to feed the stove, I looked back through the kitchen window at that doubled woodpile and those careful tracks fading under new snow. And for the first time in a long while, the day ahead did not look like punishment. It looked like something I was meant to stay for. It looked like something I was meant to stay for, and that thought unsettled me more than the tracks had. I stood at the sink with the kettle ticking itself cool and watched snow soften the edges of the yard. Watched the stone cross on the chopping block hold its shape under white dust, and felt a small, stubborn spark where there had been mostly ash for years. Grief did not lift. It just shifted over enough for curiosity to sit down beside it. That was new. Ranger curled near the stove and sighed like a man settling into an old chair, and I caught myself wondering what he knew that I did not. I put on my coat again before noon and went back outside with a carpenter's pencil, a length of mason line, and the kind of seriousness I used to save for steep ground and heavy timber. If I couldn't explain it yet, I could at least test it. I drew a chalk line across 3 rounds on the right edge of my existing stack, balanced a rusty log hook on top where any clumsy movement would knock it down, and folded the tarp flap under itself in a backward way that would show if anyone tugged it. Then I measured from shed post to stack corner and wrote the number on the legal pad right there in the yard, pencil pressing hard enough to dent through 2 pages. Ranger watched all this with his head tilted, gave one quiet chuff, and trotted to the tree line to stand and sniff like he was waiting for a late guest. By the next morning, the snow had turned to sleet and back to snow, that wet coastal winter pattern that gets into your cuffs and your temper. I cut deadfall above the creek until my right hand cramped around the saw handle, came home with 2 armloads of kindling, and found myself glancing at the extra cord every few minutes, as if it might explain itself if I stared long enough. It didn't. The stack simply stood there, neat as church pews, while the rest of my life remained its usual mix of chores and old ache. Still, when I fed the stove that evening, I noticed I was humming under my breath. Couldn't tell you what tune. Marlene used to hum when she was measuring flour, and for 1 second I nearly turned to ask her what song it was. 3 days passed before the next clear break in weather, and by then my tests had become part of my morning round. Check stove, feed dog, check stack, check line, hook, tarp fold. I felt half foolish, half steady, like a man setting trail cameras for a thief he wasn't sure existed. Sunday came with low cloud and a thin moon behind it. I split what I could before dark, stacked exactly 1 cord by the shed, and reset everything. New chalk marks on 4 rounds this time. Hook balanced crosswise. A coffee can set upside down on the back corner, where any bump would tip it. I even raked the snow smooth behind the pile to catch cleaner impressions. Ranger sat through all of it, tail tapping the frozen ground, patient with my nonsense. Monday morning, I opened the mudroom door and stopped with 1 boot still on the mat. The pile had doubled again. Not just added to, improved. The new wood was tucked in under the eave so precisely that the windward side formed a kind of wall, and my old section had been re-squared without disturbing a single test. Chalk lines still aligned. Hook still balanced. Coffee can still upside down, now set on a flatter piece as if someone had noticed it wobbled and corrected it for me. I laughed once, sharp and surprised, because it was either laugh or stand there with my mouth open in the cold like a fool. "You're showing off now," I said to the cedars, and hearing that sentence in my own voice was ridiculous enough that I added, "Much obliged anyway." I walked the perimeter slow, boots squeaking in crusted snow, and found fresh tracks arcing wide around Ranger's water pan and my kindling crate. Same depth, same length, same careful spacing. 1 print landed inches from a loose pile of split slivers and somehow left them undisturbed, like a heavy machine setting down without shaking the ground. That contrast got me, got the scale of it and the restraint. I crouched with the tape and took measurements again, then pressed a gloved hand into 1 print to compare. My hand fit inside the front half with room to spare. Ranger came up beside me, sniffed the print, then gave a little wag toward the trees as if someone had just stepped out of sight. I kept documenting because it gave me structure. Photos on phone and point and shoot, notes in the pad, weather, time, position, track count, wood species. That evening, I cleared a shelf in the mudroom and set aside a shoebox labelled Monday stacks, slid in printed photos from my old inkjet, and dated each one. Facts first, feelings later. But feelings showed up anyway, usually while I was doing plain work. Carrying ash to the bin, I'd think about those tracks detouring around my tools. Filling Ranger's bowl, I'd remember how he faced the Treeline with calm interest. No fear at all. I had spent 3 years bracing against loss, like it might return hourly with fresh paperwork. Curiosity cracked that brace just enough for air to get in. At the feed store on Thursday, Vernon caught me by the salt blocks and asked if I'd solved my mystery labour problem. I told him, not solved, documented. He barked a laugh and shook his head. Only you would make an evidence file for free firewood. I said, only me has this much time and this little social life. That got me a grin and a clap on the shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, the exchange didn't feel like acting normal. It felt normal. On my way out, I grabbed an extra bag of kibble and a cheap chalkline reel. I told the cashier I was doing quality control. She said, on a woodpile. I said, on reality, and she slid my receipt over without another question. By the second week of December, I had started arranging my Sundays around the possibility of Monday, not in fear, but in a kind of attentive respect. I cut and split what my hands allowed, left some rounds near the shed in manageable stacks, and made little markers only I would notice. A twig tucked under a bark flap, a measuring tape laid across 2 top logs, a tarp corner folded into a triangle. Each Monday brought the same answer. More wood, better structure, markers preserved. Once, after heavy wind, I found bark slabs laid over the top like shingles, with flat stones weighting the corners against gusts, smarter than my own setup. Beside the stack sat 2 sprigs of salal crossed over each other, clean and deliberate. I set them next to the wintergreen on the chopping block and left them there. That Sunday afternoon, the temperature dropped hard enough to ring in the trees. I could hear trunks cracking sharp on the far slope as daylight thinned. I finished my chores early, ate a bowl of stew, then stood at the window looking out over the yard while Ranger watched with me. I had reached the limit of what tests could tell me. Deny, test, witness, repeat. The loop was tightening, and I needed one honest look at whatever was sharing my winter. I told myself this couldn't be real, and then I told myself that sentence had run out of usefulness. Real was what left tracks and stacked wood and kept my stove fed. I took my coat off, put it back on, and decided to wait outside after dark. I set up behind the tractor shed where I had a clear angle to the woods and the woodpile both. No lantern, just moonlight and the faint spill from my kitchen window. I spread an old horse blanket on an upturned crate, poured coffee into a thermos lid, and settled in with Ranger tucked against my leg for warmth. The cold had teeth. It worked through denim and into bone, one careful bite at a time. Frost brightened the pasture grass, and the shed roof clicked as it contracted. For an hour, nothing happened. Then, sometime past full dark, the mountain quiet deepened in a way I had come to recognize. Not empty, not dead, just attentive. The first sound was a low thud from the far side of the cedars, like a heavy round set down on packed earth. Not dropped, set. Then another, closer, and the faint scrape of bark against bark. Ranger lifted his head and listened, ears forward, tail giving one slow sweep. He did not bark. I could hear my own breathing and the pulse in my throat. A shape moved between 2 trunks upslope, bigger than any man, bigger than I had allowed myself to picture. Dark fur taking moonlight along one shoulder in a soft rim. It paused at the tree line still as an old stump, then stepped into the open with a whole cedar round, cradled in both arms as easy as I carry a bucket. Scale is hard to describe unless you've spent your life around big things. I had stood beside yarders, loaders, old-growth stumps taller than houses, and this presence still reset my measure. 8 feet, maybe more, broad through the chest and back, legs thick as peeled poles, movement controlled and quiet despite the weight. It crossed to the stack without haste, lowered the round into place with fingertips guiding the fit, and pressed it once to settle the line. Then it turned for another load. No rush, no wasted motion, each trip planned. Ceremony was the word that came to me, and I almost laughed at myself for thinking it, but nothing else fit. It moved like the work mattered beyond utility. Halfway through the 4th trip, Ranger stood and padded 3 steps into the yard before I could stop him. My stomach dropped. The big figure saw him and halted immediately, round still in its arms. It waited. Ranger sniffed the air, tail loose, then took one more step and sat. The figure shifted sideways, giving him space, and set the round down wide of his path before continuing. No crowding, no startle. Just the same deliberate care I had seen in the tracks, now alive in front of me. I realized my hands were shaking so hard, coffee sloshed from the lid onto my glove, and I held still because any sudden movement felt like a rude interruption. When it turned broadside in the moonlight, I saw the fur was dark brown more than black, longer at the shoulders, shorter along the forearms where muscle moved under it. I saw hands large enough to palm both ends of a 16-inch round. I saw the head angle once toward my hiding place, not sharp, not searching, just aware. And in that instant I felt seen in a way grief had denied me for years. Not judged, not measured and found lacking, simply seen, as one winter creature noticing another doing his best to keep a small fire going. I do not remember deciding to stand, but I found myself upright at the corner of the shed, blanket falling off my knees into frost. Ranger stayed where he was, calm as a fence post. The figure held still for 2 breaths, then gave a small shift backward, creating distance rather than closing it. That gesture settled something in me. "I'm not armed," I said quietly, then almost snorted at my own choice of words because I was talking to an 8-foot stranger in my yard, like we were meeting at a gate. "You already know that, I guess." My voice sounded thin in the cold. "Thank you for the wood." It inclined its head once, slow and plain. No drama, no challenge, just acknowledgement. Then it lifted another round, placed it with the same patient precision, and stepped back toward the cedars. At the tree line it paused and looked once toward Ranger, once toward me, amber-brown eyes catching a sliver of moonlight, steady as old river stone. After that, it turned and moved between trunks that should have rattled under that weight but hardly stirred, and in 3 long steps it was shadow, and then nothing I could separate from the dark. The yard stayed quiet. The stack stood higher. Ranger trotted back to me, leaned into my leg, and I put both hands in his ruff so I had something solid to hold while my breath found its rhythm again. I stayed there until cold drove me inside, then sat at the table with my coat still on and wrote for 2 straight pages before memory could blur the edges. Time, weather, distance, movement, behavior, eye color, number of trips, Ranger's response. I wrote that I had felt no threat. I wrote that careful was still the most accurate word. At the bottom, I added 1 line I did not expect from my own hand. Witnessed and believed by me. When I finally looked up, the kitchen window showed the doubled stack under moonlight, and the faint prints leading back to the cedars, and the house no longer felt like a place where I was waiting out a sentence. It felt, cautiously, like home again. It felt, cautiously, like home again. And that scared me in a way the sight of him hadn't. I sat there with the legal pad open and the pen cooling between my fingers, listening to Ranger lick one paw clean and settle by the stove, while a part of me waited for common sense to reassert itself and call the whole thing a stress trick. That part kept getting quieter. Outside, wind nudged snow off the shed roof in soft slides, and each little thump made me look up at the window and half expect to see those amber-brown eyes again, steady and patient, as if he had only stepped back to give me room to catch up. I wrote until my hand cramped, then copied the notes clean onto a second page so I couldn't accuse myself later of exaggerating in the moment. At the top, I put date, temperature, moon phase from the almanac hanging by the fridge, and estimated distance from my position to the tree line. Under that, I listed what mattered. No aggressive posture, no rush, no startle response toward dog, deliberate spacing maintained, response to spoken thanks. One head dip. I stared at that last line a long while. It looked absurd and precise at the same time. I had spent most of my life believing those two things couldn't share a sentence. When I finally stood up, my knees barked and my lower back seized hard enough I had to brace on the chair. Ranger got up too, loyal as gravity, and followed me to the mudroom where I found the old trail camera I'd quit using after a bear knocked one off a cedar 3 years prior. I changed batteries, formatted the card, checked the infrared twice, then took it outside and strapped it to the porch post aimed towards the woodpile. I was halfway through tightening the buckle when I stopped and laughed under my breath, because there I was, midnight in wool socks and a flannel coat, installing surveillance on a benefactor I had just thanked out loud. "You've gone strange, Dale," I muttered. Neat paperwork, but strange. The camera clicked red once to tell me it was armed. I looked toward the cedars and felt foolish for speaking again, then did it anyway. "I'm not trying to trap you," I said quietly. "I'm trying to keep my own head straight." Ranger stood at my left shin, tail moving once, calm and easy. No answer came except Branch Creek and distant water, but the yard didn't feel empty. It felt shared. The next morning came clear and knife-cold, sun hitting the frosted pasture in hard white light. I carried coffee to the porch and checked the camera card before feeding the stove. There were 27 clips, most of them me shuffling around in the dark like a stiff old rooster. 2 clips held motion at the tree line around 2:14 a.m., and on both, the frame caught only the edge of a shoulder and arm as he passed behind the far cedar, too close to the trunk for a full view, as if he had seen the camera and chosen his route around it. The woodpile was higher by 6 rounds. My markers were untouched. That detail settled something deep in me. He had known I was watching. He had still come. Not sneaking in fear, not rushing through panic, just adjusting with the same courtesy he used around Ranger and my scattered tools. I poured half my coffee into Marlene's old enamel camp cup and set it on the porch rail before I could overthink it. Steam rose in a thin ribbon and vanished into morning light. By Wednesday evening, cloud rolled in heavy from the coast, and damp moved into every board seam in the house. I finished chores early and, instead of hiding behind the tractor shed, carried a folding chair to the porch and sat where I could be seen. Ranger lay with his chin on my boot. I kept my hands open on my thighs and watched the tree line darken from green to charcoal. For a long time, nothing happened. Then one cedar branch bowed and lifted, not from wind, but from weight passing under it, and he stepped into the open with a single fur round held against his chest. He stopped when he saw me, 10 paces from the first stack, broad shoulders quiet in the rain mist, head angled slightly down like he was taking my measure and offering me the same chance. I felt my pulse jump in my neck. I didn't stand. I didn't reach for anything. I nodded once, slow. "Evening," I said, voice rough from disuse. Ranger thumped his tail twice and stayed put. He moved again, set the round, and reached for another from the edge of shadow. Each trip traced a wide arc that gave the porch and dog clear space. Once, when Ranger stood to shake off damp, he paused mid-step and waited until the dog settled. He wasn't merely unafraid of me, he was factoring me in. That was the crux of it. I had spent years braced against loss, like the world was an indifferent machine. And here was a presence large enough to break my fence posts if he chose, choosing instead to work around my fragile routines, as if they had value. Rain thickened. I got up, went inside, and brought out an old canvas tarp I hadn't cut into strips yet. I laid it folded at the base of the stack and backed away. He watched me place it, then, after 2 more rounds, he picked it up with both hands, shook it once, and draped it over the top course so clean the edges hung even on both sides. I said, "That's better than I'd do," and got another small dip of the head that looked almost like agreement. He finished 3 more placements, then stepped backward into the cedars and disappeared by degrees, shape becoming bark, shadow, and rain. I sat back down and stayed there until dark closed all the way. Ranger eventually pressed his shoulder to my shin, and I rested my palm on his neck and felt warmth and wet fur and gratitude I didn't have language for yet. When I went inside, the camera had caught only blurred movement and one clear frame of his hand smoothing the tarp edge flat. I printed that frame and slid it into the Monday stacks box. 2 days later, just after noon, Ranger started barking from the mudroom in a sharp, urgent pattern he only used for live trouble. I dropped the wrench I was using on the generator housing and followed him out back toward the lower pasture. The air smelled of wet iron and cedar pitch. Near the old fence line by the alder clump, a mule deer doe was down on one knee, hind leg caught in a wire snare anchored to a post remnant hidden under grass. She wasn't thrashing, just pulling in short bursts and freezing, sides heaving white breath. Ranger stood 5 yards off, whining, tail low but not tucked. "Easy, girl," I said, mostly to keep myself steady. I crouched and saw the wire looped above the hoof, tight, but not cutting deep yet. I didn't carry bolt cutters on my belt, and my arthritic fingers couldn't unwind that gauge by hand in the cold. I backed away slow, pointed at Ranger. "Stay." He sat, vibrating with effort, and I ran for the shed to grab cutters and gloves. I was back in under 3 minutes, breath burning in my chest, boots slipping on wet grass. At 20 yards, I slowed because the scene had changed. The doe was standing now, leg still angled awkward, and he was there between her and the fence, kneeling low, one massive hand steadying the wire near the anchor, while the other turned the twisted knot with careful, precise pressure. No jerks, no force display, just method. The doe flinched once, and then stilled, ears flicking, as if she understood this giant shape was helping, not taking. I stopped at the fence rail and did nothing. It seemed like the only respectful choice. Ranger looked back at me, then at him, and gave a soft huff, almost impatient, like I was late to a task he already understood. With one final turn, the wire slackened. He widened the loop and lifted it clear of the doe's leg, then set the coil on the fence post top. The doe stood wobbling for 2 heartbeats, tested weight, and bounded toward the timberline with a hitch that eased by the 3rd stride. He watched until she vanished, then rose to full height and turned toward me. Rain beaded on his fur. His chest moved slow, controlled. I held up the bolt cutters in one hand like an apology and said, "Thank you, I was trying to get here." He looked at the cutters, then at the coiled snare, then back at me, and gave that same plain head dip. After a second, he bent and placed two short sticks crossed at the base of the post. Not dramatic, just deliberate. Then stepped past the alder shadow and was gone, uphill. I walked to the post on shaky legs. The wire coil sat neat as a shop item, and beside it lay the broken anchor stake he'd worked loose from frozen ground. The crossed sticks pointed toward my shed, same as the old message by the woodpile. Keep things in order, keep the fire going, keep living. I bagged the snare and stake in a feed sack, marked the location with orange tape, and checked the ground for other loops. Found one old rusted line farther down, sprung and empty. Cut it, bagged it too. By dusk, I had called the regional wildlife office and reported both snares. The dispatcher transferred me to an officer named Harlan, who asked practical questions and typed while I answered. "You saying poaching attempt?" he asked. "I'm saying illegal wire set on private pasture where deer move through." "Any suspect?" "No." "Any livestock loss?" "Not this time." He paused. "Can you bring the wire in tomorrow, Forks substation?" "I can. I'll label where found." "That helps. We'll log it and patrol the corridor." I drove in the next morning with the sack on the passenger floor and Ranger snoring in back. Officer Harlan met me in the lot, took the evidence, and signed my copy of the report receipt. He looked like a man who had seen every kind of odd call and had no appetite for stories beyond what could be bagged and tagged. Fine by me. I got what I needed. The snare was off my land and on record. Back home, I wrote report number, date, and officer name in the legal pad and tucked the receipt in the shoebox under a divider labelled Submitted. That afternoon, I returned to the fence post and set it right with a new brace. At the base, the crossed sticks were gone, either kicked by deer or taken by weather, but the impression where they had rested remained in the mud. I stood there with Ranger leaning into my calf and looked uphill at the cedar line where he had vanished. Wonder had moved past theory by then. It had become a working part of my days, like sharpening chain before a cut. I still measured things. I still checked weather and road conditions and my own blood pressure. But now, threaded through all that, ran an inconvenient and steady fact. Something enormous and gentle had stepped into my winter and helped what I loved without asking anything back. I stayed by that fence post until the cold bit through my gloves and my fingertips went numb, then walked back uphill with Ranger tight against my leg, both of us moving slower than usual over rutted ground. At the shed, I paused and looked at the stacks, at the clean lines and the tarp laid true. And the pressure I'd been carrying behind my ribs rose so fast I had to lean one hand on the post and breathe through it. Inside, I set water on for coffee and stood staring at Marlene's ring on its nail by the stove. I had left it there for 3 years like a paused sentence. Not put away, not worn, not spoken over. Just there. Ranger drank, circled once and lay down with a grunt. I opened the legal pad, wrote the snare report number where it belonged, and then the pen stopped moving. Facts had gotten me this far. Facts had kept me upright. But grief doesn't always yield to accounting, and gratitude doesn't fit in block letters very well. Near noon, the weather radio started repeating the same warning every 4 hours. That flat, calm voice talking about a coastal, low, deepening inland. Heavy snow above 1,000 feet. Gusts strong enough to drop lines and limbs. I did what I always did. Topped off diesel, filled 2 stock pots with water, moved kindling to the mudroom, checked the generator, checked it again. I set extra rounds by the porch and kept one eye on the sky while I worked. Ranger shadowed me from gate to shed and back, old hips stiff but spirit steady. That afternoon I called Caleb. Not for drama, for logistics, I told myself. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Dad, storm coming in hard tonight. You getting it down there? Rain and wind, mostly. You okay? I'm prepared. Just wanted you to know if service drops, that's why. A pause, then his voice softened. You want me to drive up before it hits? No, roads will turn slick by dark. Stay put with the kids. You sure? I am. I'll call when it clears. Another pause. All right, we'll be here. Love you, Dad. I held the phone tighter without meaning to. Love you too, Cal. When I hung up, the house felt different in a plain, practical way, like a door had been unlatched somewhere inside me. I went back out and hauled 6 more rounds toward the porch, knee complaining on every step. By dusk, snow had started dry and fine, blowing sideways under a wind that never seemed to inhale. The first 2 hours were manageable. Stove hot, lamps on. Ranger in and out through the mudroom to his covered run. Quick checks, quick returns. Then the wind rose another notch and stayed there, pushing at the siding, probing every seam in the house. At 9:30, the power cut out with one clean snap and left me in lantern light and the stove's orange pulse. I knew that dance too. I lit 2 more lanterns, set one in the kitchen window, pulled on my coat, and went out to bring the last of the loose rounds from beside the splitter before they iced over. The porch steps had a glaze I didn't see until my right boot hit it wrong. My leg shot out, my left knee twisted under me, and I went down hard on the 3rd step with a bright, sickening bolt up my thigh. I didn't black out, but I sat there in blowing snow with my jaw clenched and both hands locked on the rail until the nausea passed. When I tried to stand, my knee buckled. I got upright on the 2nd try, weight mostly on my right side, and limped inside with 2 rounds hugged to my chest, like that counted as success. It didn't. I had maybe half a day of easy wood at hand and a yard turning into white noise. I told myself this couldn't be happening tonight, of all nights. I told myself I could crawl if I had to. I told myself a lot of things while I braced on the counter and watched the lantern flame wobble in each gust that got through the chinks. Then Ranger barked once from the mudroom, sharp and startled, followed by a metallic crash from the run outside. I grabbed the lantern and reached the back door just in time to see one kennel panel bowed inward under drift and wind load. Ranger was pinned at the edge of it, not crushed, just trapped awkwardly and trembling, trying not to panic. My knee gave when I stepped down, and I hit the jam with my shoulder, cussing at my own body, helpless in a way I had not allowed myself to feel since the hospital. Lantern light swung across the yard, caught the woodpile, and caught movement beyond it. He came out of the cedar dark with snow streaking past his shoulders, carrying 2 full rounds under each arm as easy as split kindling. No rush, no show. He crossed to the eaves and started building a windbreak wall along the porch side, placing each round tight and true where the drift had been biting hardest. One course, then another, then a brace at the corner where crosswind funneled. He worked like a man who had watched this house through enough winters to know exactly where it failed. I stood in the doorway with tears already burning and didn't wipe them. He set the last round, turned toward the kennel, and moved there in 3 long, careful steps. Ranger gave one uncertain whine, then quieted when he knelt. Those huge hands took the bent panel near the hinge, lifted just enough, and eased it away without a jerk. He slid one forearm under Ranger's chest and hips, and lifted him the way Marlene used to lift a sleeping grandkid from the couch, steady and close. He set Ranger down against the warm porch boards right by the door, then nudged the old hound gently toward me with the back of his fingers. Something in me gave way all at once. Not tidy, not dignified. 11 winters of clenched jaw and practical lists and saying I was fine broke open on a dark porch in a storm. I sank to one knee despite the pain, put both arms around Ranger's neck, and cried into his wet fur like a man who had finally run out of places to hide from himself. I cried for Marlene and the road ice, and all the meals eaten standing up. I cried because help had arrived from the one place my worldview had never left room for, and because that help had come with gentleness, not debt. When I could breathe without shaking, I pushed myself up with the doorframe, limped to the stove, and reached for Marlene's ring on its nail. It came free with a tiny click that sounded louder than the wind. I closed it in my palm and went back out into waist-deep drift, each step a blunt flare in my knee. He stood 10 paces from the woodpile, lantern glow catching the snow on his fur and those amber-brown eyes that held me without pressure. The stone cross I had kept on the chopping block was half covered by fresh snow. I brushed it clear with my glove, set the ring on the center stone, and said out loud, voice breaking in the middle anyway, "I'm done mistaking survival for punishment. I'm done waiting for winter to take the rest of me." The words hung there, small against the wind, and for once they felt exactly true. He lowered his head once, slow and unmistakable, the same acknowledgement he had given every thanks I'd managed. Only now it felt like witness as much as answer. I stayed where I was, hand on Ranger's shoulder, tears freezing cold on my cheeks, and no shame left in them. He shifted his weight back, turned slightly so his body angled away from porch and dog, and began to leave. He did not vanish. He did not perform. He stepped backward first, giving us space, then turned toward the cedar line and walked at that same measured pace I had seen by moonlight and rain, feet finding firm ground under drift, as if he knew each root and hollow by memory. Snow drove between us in pale sheets. At the edge of the yard he paused once, looked back over one shoulder, and then continued into the trees until dark and distance folded him into the storm. Silence didn't come all at once. The wind still worked the eaves, branches still knocked and hissed, but after he was gone, the fear went out of those sounds. I stood a long while with Ranger pressed to my leg, looking at the new wall of wood under the porch overhang, at the ring resting on stone under blown snow, and at the track line leading to the cedars in broad, deep prints that were already softening at the edges. Inside, I dried Ranger with 2 old towels and checked him nose to tail. No injury beyond shaking. I gave him warm broth over kibble, then wrapped my own knee with an elastic brace and sat in Marlene's chair by the stove because it was closest, and I was done pretending that mattered less than it did. Ranger climbed halfway onto my boots and fell asleep with his muzzle on my ankle. Around midnight, I forced myself up, braced on the counter, and looked out through the kitchen window. The lantern on the porch had burned low. Snow blew past in bright slants. The wood wall he had built held clean against the wind, keeping the loose rounds dry where they would have iced and crusted by morning. I counted them once, then again, because counting calmed me. More than enough to ride out the storm. More than enough for a man on one bad knee and one good dog. I wrote in the legal pad with cramped fingers, not because I doubted what happened, but because I wanted a record of grace as exact as any weather note I had ever kept. Power out 9:31 p.m. Fall on porch step, left knee strained. Kennel panel collapse, dog trapped. Assistants observed at close range. Wood wall built under eaves. Dog freed and set safely by door. Ring placed on stone cross. Verbal statement made. Acknowledgement received. Departure to cedar line. No aggression, no demand. No sound, but weather. At the bottom, I added one more line and underlined it twice. I was not alone tonight. Sometime near dawn, the wind eased from a roar to a steady rush. I must have dozed in the chair because I woke to grey light and the stove wanting feed. Knee still hurt, but it held my weight with care. I pulled on boots, opened the mudroom door, and stepped onto a world rebuilt in white and quiet. The drifts were high against the fence, but the porch side was clear where he had stacked and braced. Ranger went out, sniffed the prints, and wagged toward the cedars before lifting his leg on the bent kennel post, like ordinary life had resumed. I walked to the chopping block. The ring still sat on the stone cross, rimmed in frost. I touched it once, then left it there. At the tree line, his tracks entered the cedars and did not come back. No circle, no lingering. Just one clean line into sheltering dark, as if kindness had been the whole purpose, and departure was simply the next right act. I stood with my hand on the nearest trunk until my fingers stung from cold, then turned back to the house, to the stove, to the dog, to the wood he had made sure I could reach, carrying a steadier kind of breath than I had known in years. I stood there a minute longer, hand on the porch rail, then went inside and reached for the phone before I could talk myself out of it. The clock over the stove read 5:42. Caleb answered on the third ring, voice thick with sleep and worry already halfway up. "Dad?" "I'm here," I said. "Power's still out, but we're fine. I've got heat. Ranger's good." He exhaled so hard I heard the bed springs complain on his end. I was about to drive up anyway. "Don't. Roads are a mess yet." I looked through the window at the wall of wood under the eaves and the cross on the block. "Listen, I want you to come in spring. Not a maybe. I want you and Lena and the kids up here for fence work and trout season. I mean it this time, not as company, as family coming home." He went quiet, and for a second I thought we'd lost signal. Then he said, softer, "Okay, we'll come. We'd like that." "I would too." Another pause, then, "You sound different, Dad." "I am," I said, and that was as far as I could carry the sentence before my throat tightened. "I'll call again when lines are stable." After we hung up, I fed the stove, brewed coffee on the camp burner, and carried one mug to the back door. Ranger pressed against my knee while I opened it. The air had that sharp, clean smell after a hard blow, cedar and cold iron and wet bark. I took the ring from the stone cross, warmed it in my palm, and hung it back on the nail by the stove when I came in. Not hidden, not entombed, kept, but moving with me now, instead of pinning me in place. 3 days later, when the county plough finally cut a clean lane past my drive, my phone buzzed with a Forks number while I was resetting the kennel panel. Officer Harlan's voice came through, clipped and practical. "Mr. Reynolds, wildlife follow-up. Patrol checked your corridor and 2 adjacent parcels. Found 1 old snare line near the creek drainage, rusted and inactive. Removed it. No fresh sets, no camp signs." "Appreciate that," I said. "We logged your report as the trigger for the sweep. Your evidence tags held up fine. If you spot anything else, call direct." "I will." He hesitated like he was deciding whether to ask a question outside his paperwork. "How's that deer area now?" "Quiet, tracks only." "Good enough for me. Stay warm up there." I wrote the call outcome in the legal pad, date and time and case number, then moved the receipt from the temporary divider to one marked closed in the shoebox. The rusted hook from my early test, the chalk-line photos, the print measurements, the blurry camera stills, the clear frame of that massive hand smoothing my tarp, all of it stayed filed in order. Nothing got tossed. Nothing got embellished. I kept the camera cards in a labelled envelope and backed the files to an old thumb drive I taped inside the lid. If my memory softened with age, the record would not. The Monday after the storm, no new stack appeared. I noticed. I nodded anyway. He had already done what needed doing. By the end of January, melt and freeze had rounded the deepest impressions near the shed into broad basins that held shadow even at noon. On a bright afternoon, with the sky gone clear as glass, I mixed plaster in a 5-gallon bucket and carried it out with a trowel, kneeling slow so my knee didn't argue too hard. Ranger stood beside me like a foreman while I poured the slurry into the cleanest print at the edge of the overhang, tapping the sides to chase bubbles. I sat on an upturned round and waited for it to set, gloved hands wrapped around a thermos cup, watching sun move through the cedars. When I lifted the cast free, it came up whole and heavy, ridges and toe marks plain as carved wood. I rinsed it at the pump, set it on the mudroom bench to cure, and later brushed on clear sealant so weather couldn't eat it. That cast stayed by the shed from then on, leaned against the post where morning light hit it first. In February, Vernon came up with a box of bolts I'd asked him to grab in town. He stood in the yard looking from the cast to the stacked wood to me, and gave me one of those long side glances men use when they're offering trust without demanding confession. "You sleeping any better?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Most nights." He nudged the cast with his boot toe, not touching, just measuring. "My granddad used to say these hills had old tenants, said they mostly wanted us to act right and keep our fires decent." He shrugged, half smile under his beard. I always figured he meant whiskey stories. "Maybe he did," I said. "Maybe." He handed me the bolts. "Either way, you look less haunted." He never asked for more. I never volunteered a grand speech. That look paid off right there in plain daylight. He chose respect over ridicule, and that gave me room to keep the mystery intact without feeling cornered by it. By the second week of April, wet green had climbed back into the pasture, and the creek ran high enough to talk all night. Caleb's truck came up the drive just after lunch on a Friday, kids bouncing in the backseat windows before the engine even cut. Maya ran straight to Ranger and buried her hands in his neck. Little Owen held up a tackle box like a trophy. Lena hugged me hard and practical, smelling like rain and laundry soap. Caleb hung back a step, studying my face. "You really meant it?" "I did." I clapped his shoulder. "You're on post-hole duty." We spent that afternoon replacing 2 sagging fence sections while the kids carried staples like sacred objects and Ranger supervised from every patch of sun. Work made talking easier. At dusk, we sat on the porch with chili bowls and cornbread, boots lined by the door, the mountain turning blue behind the cedars. Caleb noticed the cast by the shed and the shoebox on the mudroom shelf when he went for more napkins. "What's all that?" he asked, not skeptical, just careful. "Record keeping," I said. Then I took a breath and added, "And a story you can take or leave, but it's true." He listened while I told him, from the first doubled stack to the storm night and the ring on the stone cross. I did not ask him to agree. I gave him facts, the same way my father wrote rain totals. Caleb stared at the yard a long while after I finished. "I don't know what to call that," he said. "You don't have to call it anything." He nodded slowly. "I believe that you believe it, and I believe something happened here that made you come back to us." He looked over, eyes wet but steady. "That part is enough for me." Maya wandered up then with a fistful of dandelions and said, "Grandpa, can we fish at sunrise?" And the moment folded back into ordinary life so clean it felt like grace, twice over. The following winter, on the first Monday with frost silvering the grange roof, I backed my truck to the side door before dawn, with a half cord of split cedar in the bed. Hank Miller, who ran the key box, met me with a clipboard and a wool cap pulled low. "You're early," he said. "Wood doesn't stack itself," I told him, then caught my own grin and shook my head. "Most days." He laughed, handed me the hall key, and we cribbed the pile shoulder high under the awning where elders could load easy without slipping. By Christmas, there were 4 of us rotating Mondays, and by February, it had become a habit the town counted on. Mrs. Ortiz from the pharmacy brought coffee in a dented urn one icy morning and pressed a peppermint into my glove the same way she always had. "You take care of yourself, Dale," she said. "Trying to," I answered, and this time it meant something broader than endurance. I kept doing that work every winter Monday after, even when my knee barked and my hands stiffened around the maul handle. At home, the shoebox stayed organized. The camera retired but charged. The wildlife report receipts clipped to their notes. The snare entries marked, resolved. The stone cross sat on a shelf in the mudroom after Thor took the wintergreen, and Marlene's ring remained on its nail where I could see it while I brewed coffee before dawn. Some nights I still woke at 1:30 and listened to the house settle. Grief did not vanish. It changed weight. On clear mornings I sometimes stood by the shed, with Ranger gone now, and Caleb's old lab pup nosing my boots, and looked at that weather-smoothed cast, catching first light. I never saw him in full again. Once or twice over the next years, after heavy weather, I found a top course corrected on my stack or bark slabs laid just so against a coming rain. Nothing more. No performance, no claim, just the same quiet signature of care. What I carried after that 11th winter was not certainty about the whole world. It was a larger framework for it. Facts still mattered. Chains still needed sharpening. Roads still iced over if you got careless. But alongside all that, I made room for one non-trivial truth I had witnessed with my own eyes. Kindness can arrive without introduction, leave without applause, and still rebuild a man from the inside. I kept my fire lit. I kept a place at my table. And when Monday came in cold months, I stacked extra wood for whoever might be listening to Wind alone and wondering if they were meant to stay.